In the scorching summer of 1890, a small band of Arizona ranchers ventured into the Northern Territories to investigate the mysterious disappearance of their livestock. They anticipated cattle rustlers, or perhaps a pack of wolves, but the moment they crossed into that desolate expanse, the land felt fundamentally wrong. Birds had abandoned their nests. Animal tracks ceased abruptly as though erased by an invisible hand, and the very sky seemed to press down upon them with an oppressive weight that set their horses trembling. When darkness descended upon the valley, they discovered that something immeasurably vast had already marked them as its next quarry, and it was observing them from the heavens above. So, before we continue, please make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The summer of 1890 remains etched in my memory with a clarity that refuses to fade, even after all these years. The heat that season was unlike anything we had experienced before. A relentless, suffocating blanket that refused to lift even when night fell across the Arizona Territory. The air above our ranch hung thick and motionless over the scrubland and rust-red earth, as though the very atmosphere had grown too exhausted to move. Dust lingered in the yard after every footfall, taking an unnaturally long time to settle back to the ground, as if reluctant to return to its rightful place. Our cattle stood beneath the sparse mesquite trees with their heads hung low, their ribs showing far more prominently than they ought to have done at that time of year. We had lost far too many head throughout those long, brutal months, and it wasn't solely due to the drought that had gripped the region. Something else was at work out there in the wilderness, something that was methodically taking our livestock one by one. My brother Caleb was the first among us to voice the suspicion that had been growing in all our minds, though none of us had dared speak it aloud. It happened one evening at supper, when the oppressive heat had drained what little appetite we possessed. He pushed his plate away from him with barely a bite taken, wiped his mouth roughly on his shirt sleeve, and fixed our father with an unwavering stare across the rough-hewn table. "It isn't wolves," he stated flatly, his voice carrying an edge of certainty that made my stomach tighten. "Wolves leave tracks behind them. Wolves leave a bloody mess when they kill. These carcasses we've been finding, they look as though they've fallen straight out of the sky." Father didn't respond immediately. He continued chewing slowly, his eyes cast downward toward his plate, as though he might somehow avoid confronting the truth if he simply focused intently enough on his food. I glanced between them both, feeling that same uneasy dread coiling tighter in my chest. I had seen the last 2 cows we discovered out in the far pasture. Their legs had been bent at angles that defied nature, twisted in ways that made my stomach turn. Their ribs had been crushed inward with tremendous force, the bones splintered and protruding through hide. There had been no tracks anywhere around those broken bodies, no drag marks through the dirt, only flattened grass directly beneath the corpses, as though something had simply dropped them from a great height. Our ranch occupied a wide valley of sun-bleached grass and scattered rock formations, with a line of low, weathered hills stretching across the northern horizon and jagged limestone bluffs rising to the east. Anyone who wished to move cattle through that harsh country needed intimate knowledge of every dried wash, every seasonal creek bed, every precious scrap of shade a man could reach during a long day's ride under the merciless sun. I was 17 years old that fateful summer, and I had been riding fence lines and driving cattle since I was old enough to sit properly in a saddle. But in all those years working our land, I had never encountered anything remotely like those shattered, broken animals we kept discovering. Coyotes had come afterward, of course, drawn by the scent of death on the wind. But they had only torn at what was already ruined, picking at the remains of kills they would never have dared to make themselves. We weren't the only ranchers in the territory experiencing this peculiar trouble. 2 days before we finally decided to ride out and investigate properly, a neighbor from the next spread over, a weathered, hard-eyed man named Boyd, came riding up to our ranch with thick dust coating his hat and dried sweat staining his shirt in dark patches. He swung down from his saddle with visible weariness, tied his horse to our hitching post, and walked directly over to where Father and Caleb were inspecting our tack in the barn's shade. "You've been losing stock up in your northern range?" he asked without preamble, his voice rough from the dry air. Father gave a single, curt nod in response. Boyd spat into the dust at his feet and rubbed his thumb thoughtfully along his stubbled jaw. Same here. Same bloody way, too. No tracks left behind. Bones crushed in from above. My boys heard something strange out there last week during the night. They said it sounded like enormous canvas snapping in a violent storm, great wings beating against the air. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he stared toward the distant hills. But there wasn't any wind that night, not so much as a breeze. I remember how the entire yard seemed to fall silent at his words. Even the usual clatter from the kitchen where Mother worked ceased for a long, suspended moment. The truth was, I had heard something peculiar myself several nights earlier. I had been lying awake on my narrow cot positioned near the window, sweat dampening my neck despite the late hour, and the sound had drifted in through the open frame, a heavy, rhythmic beating far off in the distance, accompanied by a low, rumbling vibration that I felt more than heard in my chest. I had tried to convince myself it was distant thunder rolling across the valley. Yet when dawn came, there hadn't been a single cloud in the crystalline blue sky. We made the decision that very evening to ride out to the far range and maintain a watch through the night. Father could not afford to continue losing cattle. We were barely holding on as it was. He selected 4 of us for the expedition. Himself, Caleb, myself, and an older ranch hand named Rios who had worked our land since before I was born. When Father informed him of the plan, Rios turned to stare toward the eastern bluffs for a long, contemplative breath before responding. "That country isn't right," he said quietly, his weathered face troubled. "Some things that inhabit those wild places don't particularly care whether we understand them or not." Father's expression hardened. "Do you have something genuinely useful to contribute, or merely that?" Rios lifted one shoulder in a resigned shrug. "I'll ride with you. I'll bring my rifle along. That's all I can offer you." We departed before dawn the following morning, while the stars still burned brilliant and cold overhead. We tightened cinches on our saddles and checked our canteens thoroughly in the pre-dawn darkness. The lantern hanging on the porch cast a small, inadequate circle of golden light across the hard-packed earth of the yard. Beyond that fragile illumination, the night possessed a flat, empty quality that set my nerves on edge. Crickets chirped persistently near the well. Our breath manifested in faint, thin clouds in the cooler air that preceded sunrise. Father mounted first, settling into his saddle with practiced ease. Then Rios swung up, followed by Caleb and finally myself. The sound of iron-shod hooves striking the hard ground echoed against the barn wall before fading into the vast openness that surrounded us on all sides. The sky began to pale gradually behind the eastern bluffs as we rode steadily northward. Colors shifted from deep indigo to pearl gray, then progressed to a pale wash of yellow as the sun prepared to make its appearance. The land opened around us like an enormous stage, low grass brushing against our boots, occasional yucca plants standing in solitary vigil across the wilderness. My horse moved with a steady, comforting rhythm beneath me, and the leather of the saddle creaked softly in time with each measured step. I watched dust rise in small puffs from the hooves of the riders ahead of me, creating temporary clouds that quickly dissipated. My shirt clung uncomfortably to my back with sweat before the sun had even cleared the horizon properly. Our destination was a series of low ridges on the northern boundary of our property. From that elevated vantage point, we would be able to observe several of the draws and shallow valleys where the cattle preferred to graze during the hottest parts of the day. That was precisely where we had discovered most of the dead animals over the preceding weeks. As we rode, Caleb dropped back from his position to fall in alongside me. "You heard it as well, didn't you?" he asked in a low voice, glancing toward me. I didn't need to ask what he meant. "That sound 2 nights past," I confirmed, nodding slowly. Heavy and rhythmic. I attempted to convince myself it was thunder. He shook his head emphatically. I went outside when I heard it properly. There weren't any clouds whatsoever. The stars were perfectly clear right across the entire sky. The sound came from somewhere over those hills yonder. He pointed with his chin toward the ridges we were steadily approaching. It continued for perhaps 10 minutes or so, and then it simply ceased, ending abruptly as though someone had shut a heavy door. I desperately wanted to tell him he was mistaken, that he'd misheard something ordinary and explicable. I wanted to insist it had been distant wagons traveling along some far-off trail, or perhaps some peculiar trick of the wind carrying sounds from miles away. But the vivid image of those shattered carcasses came flooding back into my mind, and the words died in my throat before I could speak them. By mid-morning, the heat had well and truly settled over us like a physical burden. The sun burned down mercilessly from a sky utterly devoid of clouds or any other cover. Sweat stung my eyes repeatedly, forcing me to wipe my face on my sleeve. The horses' flanks darkened with damp patches that spread steadily. We eventually found the small herd we had left grazing in the northern pasture, clustered together near a thin line of shade along a rocky outcrop. The animals shifted nervously as we approached, their tails flicking constantly, their heads turning toward the sky far more frequently than toward us. I had grown up surrounded by cattle my entire life. They typically watched the ground as they moved, searching for patches of decent grass or focusing on one another within the herd. But that day, they kept glancing upward repeatedly, as though expecting something to descend upon them from above at any moment. We established our camp on a low rise near the center of that section of the range. From that position, we commanded a clear view in every direction across the surrounding landscape. Father intended for us to remain through the night and well into the following day. If cattle rustlers were operating in the area, we would observe them. If a predatory animal was responsible, we would hear it approaching. We staked out the horses carefully, constructed a modest fire ring from gathered stones, and laid out our bedrolls in a loose circle around the camp. None of us engaged in much conversation whilst we worked. Each of us paused periodically, our eyes drifting toward the distant ridges and the vast, empty sky above. That by late afternoon, clouds began forming unexpectedly in the distance to the west. They rose in a tall, towering column, dark and threatening at the base, with brilliantly lit edges where the sunlight caught them. There had been absolutely no hint of their formation even an hour previously. The air shifted subtly, carrying with it a faint smell of ozone that made the fine hairs on my forearms stand upright. Storm approaching rapidly, Father observed, watching the clouds with narrowed, assessing eyes. We didn't observe any weather front this morning when we set out. Rios knelt beside our fire ring and fed several more branches into the small flames. Sometimes storms rise seemingly from nowhere in this country, he said carefully, his tone suggesting hidden meanings. The old stories claim they ride on something's back, carried along by forces we don't properly understand. The deliberate way he spoke those words sent a small chill racing along my spine despite the oppressive heat. I studied him for a moment, then turned my gaze upward toward the sky. The clouds climbed higher and higher, building into an enormous tower, yet the air immediately around us remained almost completely still. No strong wind picked up to herald the storm's arrival. No distant thunder rolled across the valley to announce its coming. The whole situation felt fundamentally wrong, as though half of what should be present was mysteriously missing. Toward evening, as the light began to fail, we saddled our horses once more and rode a slow, careful circle around the grazing herd. The cattle shifted uneasily, bunching together far more tightly than was their usual habit. Several calves bleated plaintively and pressed close against their mother's flanks for comfort and protection. The sun dropped steadily behind the western clouds, transforming the light into something flat and dim. Long shadows stretched dramatically from the sparse bushes and scattered rocks, reaching across the ground like grasping fingers. We inspected the fence lines, such as they were in that remote location. Rough and rudimentary constructions, designed more to guide the cattle than to genuinely contain them. Everything appeared undisturbed at first glance, showing no signs of tampering or forced passage. We discovered the first genuine sign of something unusual near a dry wash at the base of the northern ridge. Caleb spotted it before I did. He raised one hand sharply and brought his horse to an immediate halt, staring intently at the sandy ground below. I urged my mount forward to ride up beside him and followed the direction of his fixed gaze. There, pressed deeply into the pale, fine sand, was an impression unlike anything I had ever encountered before. It stretched wider than I could span with my outstretched arms, with long, parallel grooves at one end, each terminating in a deeper puncture mark. The sand surrounding the main impression had a disturbed, scattered appearance, as though something enormously heavy had struck from directly above and then bounced or lifted away again almost immediately. Father and Rios joined us promptly. Father dismounted with deliberate care and stepped cautiously around the strange mark, clearly unwilling to disturb it until he'd examined it thoroughly. He crouched down and touched the very edge of the impression with two extended fingers, testing its depth and consistency. Not a hoof print, he stated with absolute certainty. Not a wagon wheel, not the paw of a large cat, not a bear's track. Nothing I recognize. Rios folded his arms across his chest, his expression deeply troubled. Whatever made this fell hard, he observed quietly. It came straight down from above, judging by the impact pattern. I found myself looking upward instinctively, scanning the sky for any sign of what might have created such a mark. The heavens above us held only high, thin wisps of cloud near the rising storm mass in the distance. There were no birds whatsoever in sight, no vultures circling on thermal currents, no crows calling to one another, nothing but empty blue stretching toward the dark wall of the approaching clouds on the horizon. We followed the dry wash a bit farther along its winding course and discovered another mark, this one considerably shallower, as though something had merely brushed the surface rather than striking it with full force. Beyond that second impression, there was absolutely nothing. No trail leading away from the site, no sequence of prints indicating travel in any particular direction, just the wash curling along the base of the ridge before disappearing into a confusing maze of tumbled rocks. My chest constricted with a feeling I desperately didn't want to acknowledge or name. The land I had known intimately throughout my entire life no longer felt familiar or safe. The physical shapes and features remained identical, but some unseen order that governed the natural world had fundamentally shifted. I glanced sideways at Caleb and saw that his jaw was set firmly, though his eyes moved across the sky in short, rapid movements, as though expecting something to appear at any moment. "We're staying regardless," Father announced, his voice noticeably harder than it had been earlier. "Whatever is responsible for this will not be permitted to take any more of my herd. We shall maintain a watch in pairs throughout the night." I didn't argue with his decision. None of us did. Still, as we turned our horses and began riding back toward our camp, I felt a heavy weight settle between my shoulder blades. It remained with me even after the sun completed its descent, and the first low, ominous rumbles began to reach us from the direction of that strange, rapidly building storm. We consumed a quick, utilitarian meal before full darkness descended upon us. Strips of dried jerky and tinned beans warmed over our small fire. The storm to the west had expanded into an enormous wall of churning clouds. Forked lightning flashed brilliantly along the distant horizon in short, irregular bursts. A thin wind began to move across the dry grass, carrying with it a peculiar smell, dry yet somehow charged with electricity, that made the skin on my arms contract and tighten involuntarily. Our horses shifted their weight constantly and tossed their heads far more than usual, despite the fact that we had given them ample water and checked all their tack carefully for any signs of discomfort or irritation. Something about the approaching night was setting them on edge. Father organized the watch schedule with military precision. He and I would assume responsibility for the first half of the night, maintaining vigilance whilst the others rested. Then Caleb and Rios would relieve us and take over until dawn broke. The herd had drawn considerably closer to the slight rise where we had established our camp, their bodies forming a dense, dark mass against the pale ground. Periodically, a low, uneasy lowing reached our ears, There were no other sounds except the intermittent crackle of our dying fire and the far-off mutter of thunder that seemed to grow no nearer despite the passing time. When the last traces of light vanished completely from the western horizon, the sky transformed into something very black between the scattered points of starlight and the moving edge of the storm. We extinguished most of the fire to preserve our night vision, leaving only glowing embers, and positioned ourselves a short distance apart, our rifles resting across our knees. My eyes roamed constantly between the herd below, the dark silhouettes of the ridges, and the narrow strip of sky visible above us. My ears strained continuously for anything beyond the usual insects and the faint movements of restless cattle. For what seemed an interminable period, nothing whatsoever changed or happened. After perhaps an hour or so had passed, my thoughts began to drift back over the events of the day. The strange imprint in the sandy wash remained vividly present in my mind. I attempted repeatedly to fit it into something I already knew and understood, some category of animal or natural phenomenon that would provide a rational explanation. Wings didn't leave marks of that particular character. Hooves certainly didn't fall in such a wide pattern. I recalled Boyd's sons speaking of that peculiar sound they'd heard, that great beating with no wind present to carry it. My chest felt constricted again, and I had to consciously force myself to breathe steadily and keep my gaze moving systematically across our surroundings. Sometime well past midnight, the air shifted dramatically. The wind dropped away entirely until it barely disturbed the grass growing at our feet. The crickets fell silent almost instantaneously, as though responding to some signal we couldn't perceive. The sudden, profound quiet pressed against my eardrums uncomfortably. I glanced over toward Father and saw that he had turned his head slightly to one side, listening intently. He raised one hand slowly, palm flat, a clear signal for me to remain absolutely still and silent. At first, I could hear nothing whatsoever. Then, gradually a low pulse reached us from somewhere above. It didn't sound remotely like wagon wheels rattling over rough ground, or horses' hooves striking stone, or any storm I had ever experienced in my life. It arrived in slow, enormously heavy beats, each one carrying with it a faint but palpable pressure that seemed to brush against my chest and shoulders. Between those deliberate beats, an uneven rumbling sound spread across the sky overhead, seeming to shift location from one section of darkness to another, proving impossible to pinpoint accurately. The cattle reacted before I had fully processed what I was hearing. A visible ripple of movement passed through the entire herd like a wave crossing water. Some animals pushed forcefully against others, attempting desperately to press toward the relative safety of the center of the group. Calves cried out with high, piercing voices that spoke of pure terror. One cow suddenly bolted a short distance away from the herd and then halted abruptly, her sides heaving with panicked breaths. Our horses jerked violently against their picket lines and snorted loudly, their eyes rolling to show the whites in the faint glow cast by our fire's remaining coals. The sound emanating from above us grew steadily stronger and more distinct. The slow beats drew closer together in frequency. The pressure I could feel against my body deepened noticeably, as though the air itself had somehow gained substantial weight and mass. I tilted my head far back and squinted upward, attempting desperately to pick out a definite shape against the field of stars. For several long moments, I could see absolutely nothing unusual. Then, quite suddenly, one entire section of the sky turned darker than everything surrounding it. It moved deliberately, sliding smoothly across the star field without presenting any outline I could properly hold onto or comprehend. Stars vanished systematically behind this moving darkness, and then reappeared in its wake once it had passed over them. Father rose to his feet in one unhurried but purposeful motion and lifted his rifle into a ready position. "Don't discharge your weapon unless it comes directly for us," he said quietly but firmly. "We cannot afford to waste ammunition shooting at shadows and empty air." His voice remained steady and controlled, but I could detect the underlying effort he was expending to maintain that false calm. I stood up beside him, gripping my own rifle tightly, my mouth gone, completely dry. My heart hammered so violently that I could feel each beat pulsing in my throat. The heavy-wing beats swung in a wide arc over our position and then swept outward directly toward the cluster herd. The cattle bellowed in collective terror and surged together in a rough, panicked wave. Dust rose thick around their milling bodies, faintly visible in the darkness. Something passed overhead again, noticeably lower this time. I still couldn't discern a clear, definite form. Only a broad absence of light against the sky, far too large to match any bird I had ever seen or even heard described. The wind that followed in its wake carried a peculiar, sharp smell. Not the stench of rot, not the musk of a mammalian predator, but something distinctly mineral and harsh that made my nose sting and my eyes water. There came a single, abbreviated scream from one of the cows, a sound of pure agony that was cut off almost as soon as it began. I glimpsed sudden movement at the very edge of the herd through the darkness and swirling dust. A brief lift followed by an equally brief drop. Dust boiled up violently around that specific spot. The dark shape overhead lurched perceptibly, then began to climb with slow but immensely powerful strokes. For just a moment, as distant lightning flared brilliantly behind the far-off storm, I saw considerably more than I had before. A vast wing spread across the entire sky directly above us. Individual feathers edged in a pale, ghostly outline created by the distant flash of light. The span of it utterly dwarfed any eagle or condor I had ever observed, even from great distance. The tips of those enormous feathers appeared ragged and worn, yet each deliberate stroke through the air carried tremendous, almost incomprehensible force. Beneath that colossal wing, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a wickedly hooked beak and a massive head that turned with sharp, predatory intent. For the briefest instant, I saw eyes reflecting a faint, cold gleam from the lightning on the distant horizon. Eyes that spoke of ancient intelligence and absolute confidence in its dominance. Then the concealing darkness closed over the creature once more, swallowing it completely. The beats of those enormous wings gradually grew fainter as the creature moved away from us, carrying whatever unfortunate animal it had seized. The herd remained in agitated motion for some time afterward, milling about and calling out in distress, but no additional animals were taken or fell. Slowly, painfully slowly, the cattle began to settle into a tight, restless cluster. The crickets, however, remained utterly silent. Even the distant thunder seemed somehow subdued, as though nature itself was holding its breath. I realized with a start that I hadn't taken a single full breath since that terrible scream had rent the air. When I finally forced myself to draw air properly into my lungs, my chest ached sharply from the deprivation. I turned to look at Father, seeking some reassurance or explanation. He maintained his fixed gaze on the sky for several more long moments before finally lowering his rifle to a less ready position. His face appeared drawn and aged in the dim, uncertain light. "You saw it," I stated, though it wasn't truly a question. My voice emerged rough and strained, barely recognizable as my own. He nodded once, slowly and deliberately. I saw quite enough to know what we're facing. We stood there together in the gradually thinning darkness, neither of us speaking another word until the oppressive weight in the air eased somewhat, and a few of the normal night sounds hesitantly crept back into the silence. When our watch period finally ended and the time arrived to wait Caleb and Rios for their turn, I discovered I had absolutely no desire to lie down and attempt sleep. Rest felt like an impossible dream, something that belonged to a different world entirely. Still, Father insisted with characteristic firmness that we adhere to the established schedule. "We shall require clear heads come tomorrow," he said with finality. "Whatever that creature might be, it will not represent the last of our considerable problems." When I shook Caleb awake and recounted in hushed tones what had transpired during our watch, he stared past me toward where the herd continued to shift uneasily in the darkness. "It took one of them?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yes," I confirmed, nodding. Cleanly, swiftly. No sound whatsoever after that initial scream. He pulled on his boots with jerky, tense movements, his jaw visibly clenched. "Then it will most certainly come again," he stated with grim certainty. "Nothing that hunts in such a manner takes only once. It knows where the easy prey can be found now." I lay down on my bedroll as instructed, but I kept my eyes open and staring at the slowly lightening sky. I listened to the second half of the night unfold in small, disconnected fragments. Low murmurs passing between Caleb and Rios, the occasional nervous stamp of an iron-shod hoof against stone, one brief burst of cattle noise that thankfully died away quickly. To my profound relief, those heavy-wing beats did not return before dawn finally broke. At last, pale gray light began to seep gradually into the eastern sky, and I pushed myself upright with stiff, protesting arms and a head that felt stuffed with cotton wool. The herd looked noticeably smaller in the strengthening morning light. A visible gap in their numbers that hadn't been there the previous evening. We rode out as soon as there was sufficient light to see by and conducted a thorough count of the remaining animals. One full-grown cow had vanished entirely during the night. There was no body left behind, no blood staining the ground, no torn earth to mark a struggle. Only a broad area of churned, overlapping hoof prints where the terrified cattle had surged together in panic. I felt a profound hollowness opening in my chest like a physical wound. Observing that absence in the clear daylight somehow pressed the terrible truth in deeper and made it more real than even the brief, horrifying vision in the darkness had managed to do. Father gathered the three of us near the rise where we had made camp. His eyes were noticeably bloodshot from severe lack of sleep, and deep lines bracketed his mouth. "We face a choice now," he announced gravely. "We can attempt to drive the herd back toward the home pastures and hope desperately that such action will prove sufficient to keep them safe from further predation. Alternatively, we can remain out here in this remote location and make a genuine attempt to stop whatever this creature might be." Rios turned his weathered face toward the distant ridges, his expression deeply troubled. "If we move the cattle now, it will simply follow them," he said with absolute conviction. "It has located easy, abundant prey. Such a predator will not forget where the feeding ground lies." Caleb swiveled to face Father directly. "We cannot merely wait passively whilst it systematically picks them off one by one," he argued forcefully. "We may only receive a single opportunity to confront it on ground of our own choosing, where we possess some advantage." I listened carefully to their debate and felt a grim resolve beginning to form beneath my persistent fear. The creature in the sky was undeniably real, a physical being with substance and weight. It left distinct marks in sand and notable gaps in our herd. If it existed solidly in our world, bound by the same physical laws as everything else, then surely it could bleed and die in our world as well. I clung desperately to that rational thought as we continued to argue over our next course of action, even as the memory of those crushing wing beats and that brief glimpse of impossible size pressed in on us from every side. After considerable discussion, Father reached his decision. We would not return home just yet. If we retreated now, the creature could easily strike closer to the ranch house proper, where we kept significantly more cattle, more horses, and where we had considerably less open ground to maneuver. Out here in this remote valley, we possessed room to observe it approaching. We had ridges we could climb for improved vantage points. We had space to mount a defense, or, if fortune favored us, to drive it off permanently or even kill it outright if such a thing proved possible. None of us spoke aloud the darker possibility we all recognized. If we failed in our attempt, the creature would follow us back to the ranch anyway, and then we would face it with our families directly in harm's way. The sun climbed steadily higher into a pale, washed-out sky devoid of any clouds. The storm that had threatened from the west had drifted northward during the night without ever reaching us, leaving behind only that persistent charged smell in the air, faint now, but stubbornly present. We saddled our horses once more and carefully moved the nervous herd into a somewhat wider basin that was ringed on all sides by low hills. It wasn't a proper corral by any means, but those surrounding hills provided some basic shape and definition to the area, offering at least the illusion of containment and protection. The cattle bunched up even more tightly than usual as we drove them, moving as though they fully expected the sky itself to drop something terrible upon them at any given moment. Whilst Father and Caleb rode ahead to thoroughly inspect the far end of the basin and ensure there were no hidden dangers or escape routes, I remained behind with Rios near the center of the milling herd. I watched the animals shift and lift their heads repeatedly, their ears twitching nervously, their bodies pressed so close together that the substantial heat rising from their massed forms made the air above them shimmer and waver visibly. I could hear their labored breathing and the steady clack of hooves striking against loose stones scattered across the ground. Every few minutes without fail, one animal would snort loudly and shake its head whilst glancing upward toward the empty sky, as though expecting attack from above. I have witnessed many strange and inexplicable things during my years, Rios said quietly as he methodically checked the ammunition load in his rifle. Out in the mountains far south of here, in territories most men never venture into. But nothing, absolutely nothing, with a wingspan of that extraordinary magnitude. You've encountered something similar to this before? I asked, surprised by this revelation. He shook his head emphatically. Not this particular creature, never anything precisely like this. But I have developed an instinct for recognizing when land has become fundamentally uneasy, when a natural order has been disturbed. This entire place has felt profoundly wrong for weeks now, long before we rode out here. The birds departed their nests before the worst heat arrived. Animal tracks disappear inexplicably in the dust where they should continue. Storms gather without carrying any actual moisture. Everything feels unbalanced. Do you believe it's somehow tied directly to that creature we witnessed? I pressed. I believe it is not alone, he said quietly, his words sending ice down my spine despite the oppressive heat. Some places breed oddities and abnormalities, things that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of the world. Perhaps this monstrosity hatched somewhere in those distant cliffs. Perhaps it wandered here from some territory even farther afield. But nothing of that enormous size ventures into an inhabited valley unless something powerful has driven it out from its previous hunting grounds, or unless something even worse has deliberately brought it here for purposes we cannot fathom. His ominous words remained with me as we rode forward to regroup with Father and Caleb. We found them sitting astride their horses near the far ridge, staring intently toward a cluster of jagged rock spires that rose dramatically from the ground like the weathered, broken remains of some ancient fortification. A narrow, treacherous-looking path wound between two of the tallest spires, barely wide enough to accommodate a horse and rider. Father pointed directly toward those forbidding rocks. There are tracks clearly visible in the dust there, he announced grimly. Not hoof prints, not boot prints from any human. Something was dragged bodily across the ground in that location. Caleb leaned forward over his saddle horn, squinting at the disturbed earth. The marks simply stop abruptly in the middle of the path, he added, his voice tight with tension. Nothing leads outward from that point. It's as though whatever made them simply vanished in a thin air. I thought again of that deeply pressed imprint we had discovered the previous day in the sandy wash. Something falling from a great height. Something lifting away with tremendous force. Something dropping suddenly out of sight into those shadowed rocks with its captured prey. We rode closer with considerable caution. The rock spires towered imposingly above us in their crooked, irregular line. Their rough surfaces cracked and weathered, streaked with pale mineral veins that caught the sunlight. The shadows cast between them were deep and impenetrable even in the full light of day. The narrow path cutting through the center sloped downward at a steep enough angle that I couldn't discern where it ultimately terminated. I felt fresh sweat gathering at the back of my neck, though whether from heat or apprehension I couldn't say. We dismounted carefully and secured our horses to a low, sun-warmed boulder. Father assumed the lead position. Caleb followed close behind him. I went third in line, and Rios maintained a vigilant watch over our backs, his rifle held ready. As we advanced slowly into the narrow pass between the towering spires, the air cooled noticeably, a welcome relief that somehow felt more ominous than comforting. The silence pressed in heavily around us, thick and oppressive. Even the distant sounds from the cattle faded behind us until they became nothing more than a barely audible hum. The ground inside the pass slanted steadily downward toward a small, relatively flat area nestled between the spires. In the dust covering that open space, I observed fresh disturbances that made my stomach clench. A wide drag mark scored deep into the earth, parallel furrows where something enormously heavy had been pulled or dropped with tremendous force, and a compressed patch where the ground had been packed down in a shape far too broad and irregular to make any conventional sense. I knelt down carefully and brushed aside a layer of loose dust with the back of my hand. Underneath, the compacted dirt had hardened as though subjected to truly tremendous weight and pressure. Caleb crouched beside me, studying the ground intently. He didn't speak immediately. His eyes scanned methodically across the disturbed earth, then traveled upward to examine the rock walls towering above us on all sides. "It conceals itself here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it brings what it takes, where it drops its kills." Father stepped forward and examined the entire area in profound silence, his jaw visibly tightening. "There's no blood whatsoever," he observed, his tone troubled. "It didn't consume the cow here in this location. Perhaps it carries things even farther," I suggested, though my voice lacked conviction. "To some more remote feeding ground. Or it maintains a nest," Rios murmured quietly, and that single word sent a wave of cold dread washing through my chest. A nest meant eggs. A nest meant offspring. A nest meant the terrifying possibility that there was more than one of these creatures. I attempted to dismiss the thought as paranoid speculation, but the evidence of purposeful activity scattered around us suggested something large moving with definite intent and established patterns. The behavior of a creature with a permanent territory rather than a transient hunter. Before we could examine the site any further or draw additional conclusions, a deep, resonant tremor passed through the surrounding rocks. It wasn't powerful enough to physically shake the ground beneath our feet, but the vibration traveled distinctly through the air itself like a palpable pulse. I looked upward sharply toward the jagged ridge tops high above us. A massive shadow slid across them with unnatural speed, too swift to track properly with the naked eye, yet unmistakably vast in scale. Father raised his rifle to a ready position in one smooth motion. "Back to the herd," he commanded sharply. "Now, move." We scrambled out of the narrow pass and mounted our horses with urgent haste. The animals sensed our alarm and moved without any need for encouragement or urging. When we cleared the last intervening rise and the basin came back into view below us, the cattle were already in frantic motion, pushing desperately toward the southern side of the enclosed area, their bodies heaving and shifting in visible panic. Thick dust rose around them in choking clouds. Above the milling herd, a dark shape circled with lazy, predatory grace. Thin sunlight caught along the leading edges of its wings as it dipped slightly and then rose again in a smooth arc. Each slow, powerful flap sent a rolling pressure wave across the ground that I could feel even at this distance. The sound grew progressively louder with every completed pass, that same heavy, rhythmic beating I had heard during the terrifying night watch. The creature angled its body downward in a shallow dive, then climbed again with effortless power, methodically surveying the herd below with a predatory patience that twisted my stomach into knots. It was assessing, calculating, choosing its next victim with cold deliberation. "It's hunting in broad daylight," Caleb said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "It's not remotely afraid of us or our presence. It possesses no reason whatsoever to fear us," Rios replied grimly. "It understands its own strength perfectly well." Father spurred his horse forward without hesitation. We need to disrupt its hunting pattern, he declared forcefully. If we can scatter the herd in multiple directions, it may lose focus on any single target and abandon the attack. What if that action makes the situation considerably worse? I asked, voicing the concern we were all thinking. We have absolutely no choice remaining, Father said with finality. It will systematically pick them off one by one if we allow it to continue hunting unmolested. We rode hard into the basin, driving our mounts at dangerous speed. Dust churned thick beneath the horses' pounding hooves, reducing visibility significantly. Cattle surged away from us in panicked waves, their terror rising to fever pitch. The creature circling above shifted its flight pattern immediately, its enormous dark body tilting with controlled, almost leisurely precision. I could see its head clearly now, long and sharp-beaked like some monstrous raptor, with eyes fixed intently on the chaotic movement below, as we cut aggressively through the herd, attempting to create deliberate channels and drive groups of animals toward the surrounding hills where they might find some measure of cover. The creature swooped noticeably lower. The wind generated by its passing wings struck us with the force of a sudden pressure drop. My hat very nearly flew off my head. My horse stumbled badly, then managed to recover its footing at the last moment. "Keep moving," Father shouted over the chaos. "Don't stop for anything." The creature passed directly overhead once more, so close I could have reached up and touched its trailing feathers had I been foolish enough to try. I lifted my gaze for a split second, unable to resist. The underside of its wings stretched across the entire sky like a living canopy composed of thousands of dark feathers, each one as long as my forearm. Beneath its massive chest, I saw clearly the curl of talons, each one long and wickedly curved, more than capable of piercing clean through a steer's flank. Its feathers shifted and rustled in overlapping layers, each individual plume edged in a dull, matte sheen that spoke of age and wear. Caleb rode alongside me, his face pale beneath the coating of dust. "We cannot possibly outride it," he said, stating the obvious truth we all recognized. "If it decides it wants one of us specifically, we're far too slow to escape." "We stay together," I insisted firmly. "It will target the cattle first. They're easier prey and more abundant." Before he could respond to that assertion, the creature pivoted its body sharply and entered a steep, committed dive. The sound of its rapid descent tore through the air like ripping canvas. It aimed directly for a cluster of cows bunched together near the far end of the basin. One terrified animal broke away from the group and bolted desperately across open ground. That single moment of isolation was precisely what the creature had been waiting for. It struck the fleeing cow with an impact that sent dust exploding outward in a thick, expanding ring. The cow screamed once, a sound of pure agony, and then fell abruptly silent. But unlike its nocturnal hunt, the creature didn't immediately lift away with its prize this time. Instead, it remained firmly on the ground, and the sight of it standing there in the settling dust sent a profound jolt of primal fear through my entire body. Its legs were far thicker and more powerfully muscled than I had imagined possible, ending in those terrible talons that were already buried deep in the cow's torn flesh. Its neck arched gracefully as it adjusted its grip on the dying animal. The top of its head, even with neck bent, reached considerably higher than any man could stand. Its feathers lay close against its body, dark and coarse, shifting subtly with each breath the creature took. The wings folded back only halfway, but even in that partially folded state, they cast an enormous shadow across the entire basin floor. Father pulled his horse to an abrupt halt, his eyes never leaving the grounded predator. "This is our opportunity," he announced, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Whilst it's earthbound and distracted, Caleb looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination, but he nodded his agreement without hesitation. I swallowed hard against the dryness in my throat. The creature bent over the fallen cow, tearing efficiently at the hide with that massive curved beak. It appeared completely unconcerned with our presence, utterly confident in its dominance. That confidence shattered the instant Father fired the first shot. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed dramatically off the surrounding ridges. The bullet struck the creature's muscular shoulder, sending a burst of dark feathers spinning into the air. The creature's reaction was immediate and terrifying. It released a sound that physically shook the ground beneath us, a deep, vibrating shriek that pressed painfully into my chest and rattled my teeth in their sockets. It turned its massive head toward us in one sharp, deliberate motion, its eyes fixed directly upon us, and I felt the weight of that predatory stare like a physical force. Those eyes were predominantly dark, but possessed a bright, narrow ring of gold around each pupil. They were utterly cold, intensely focused, the calculating stare of an apex predator that had never known fear or defeat. Then it spread its wings to their full, terrible extent. The wings opened so incredibly wide that for several heartbeats the sun vanished entirely behind them, plunging us in a sudden shadow. Dust lifted in a rolling wave as the creature braced its powerful legs. I gripped my reins hard enough to hurt and struggled to steady my rifle with trembling hands. The air filled with the rough, harsh scrape of thousands of feathers shifting purposefully into their attack positions. The creature stepped forward deliberately away from the fallen cow, each movement radiating lethal intent. Its talons left deep, distinct impressions in the hard-packed ground. "Spread out," Father yelled urgently. "Force it to choose a single target." We fanned out rapidly on horseback, moving on pure instinct without requiring additional direction. The creature tracked our dispersing movement with quick, precise jerks of its head, assessing each of us in turn. Its wings rose and fell in small, controlled pulses, not yet launching into flight, but clearly building the necessary force for a devastating attack. I could actually feel the ground vibrating subtly beneath my horse's nervous hooves. Father fired again without warning. The shot struck the creature's side with a solid impact. It flinched noticeably, its wings twitching upward in response. Caleb and I fired in quick succession. One bullet grazed along the leading edge of its left wing. The other buried itself somewhere in its heavily muscled flank. More dark feathers scattered and drifted on the disturbed air, but the creature didn't stumble or show any sign of significant injury. Instead, it lifted its head even higher, opening that massive beak to release another cry. This sound pierced even more painfully than the first. It stung the delicate interior of my ears and seemed to push an uncomfortable pressure down my throat, making it difficult to breathe properly. Rios spurred his horse forward with reckless courage, bringing himself considerably closer than the rest of us dared to venture. He rode skillfully between two clusters of panicked cattle, using the dust they kicked up as a partial screen for his approach. He lifted his rifle smoothly and took careful aim at the creature's eye, aiming to blind it, to give us a genuine advantage. The creature moved before Rios could fire his carefully aimed shot. It lunged forward with shocking speed, its wings slamming downward in a single violent, explosive motion. The tremendous rush of displaced air struck Rios's horse broadside with overwhelming force. The horse reared back sharply and twisted its body, very nearly throwing its rider completely. Rios held on desperately with one hand, whilst clenching the reins and leaning low along his mount's neck. His rifle discharged accidentally, the shot firing wide and striking nothing but empty ground. The creature closed the distance between them in just a few long, powerful strides. Its talons smashed into the earth precisely where Rios had been positioned only a heartbeat earlier. Dirt and stones sprayed upward in a hard, violent arc. Rios jerked his horse aside with expert horsemanship at the last possible instant. But the creature's beak snapped shut mere inches from his leg, close enough that I heard the sharp click of its closing mandibles over the general chaos. The horse screamed in absolute terror and bolted frantically, carrying Rios away from the creature's immediate reach. Father and Caleb fired repeatedly. I joined them, forcing myself to breathe slowly and steadily despite my racing heart. One bullet punched into the creature's wing bone with a solid thud. It shuddered perceptibly and released a harsh hiss, its feathers bristling aggressively. It pivoted its full body toward us, acknowledging us as genuine threats. Its wings rose majestically, reaching their absolute fullest span, and then slammed downward again with a force that physically shook the entire basin. The creature launched itself into the air with astonishing power. A sheet of dust rose beneath it, obscuring everything. The cattle scattered frantically in all directions, their formation completely breaking apart. The horses danced sideways nervously, their hooves scraping against rock. I ducked low in my saddle instinctively as the creature surged upward, its wings pumping with heavy, deliberate strokes. It gained altitude rapidly, beginning to circle above us, its massive shadow gliding ominously across the ground below. Caleb reloaded with practiced speed, his hands moving efficiently on pure instinct and years of training. "It's searching for an opening now," he observed tensely, waiting for one of us to make a mistake. Father kept his rifle trained upward, tracking the creature's circular flight path. "We hold our current positions," he ordered firmly. "Don't scatter or run. If we separate, it will isolate one of us and we'll have no chance of rescue." The creature banked smoothly to the right, its wings bending slightly as they caught the rising thermal currents. It circled once, twice, 3 times, each pass bringing it gradually lower. Then it tipped its body downward into a steep, aggressive angle. I realized with sudden, ice-cold clarity precisely where it was aiming before anyone spoke a word of warning. It was coming directly for me. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I wrenched my horse around sharply, kicked hard, and leaned low along its neck, making myself as small a target as possible. The creature descended with a speed I could barely track with my eyes. The sound of its wings beat against my back like physical blows. Dust swirled around me in dense, blinding clouds. I heard the creature's hunting cry, deep and resonant, closing the distance with terrifying rapidity. A shot rang out sharply, Caleb's rifle, fired with desperate precision. The creature swerved abruptly mid-dive, veering slightly off its intended path. Its extended talons raked through empty air where I had been positioned only an instant before. My horse stumbled badly over rough ground, but somehow managed to regain its footing. I didn't dare look back. I kept riding hard until Father's commanding voice cut through the surrounding chaos. "Turn around. Don't let it chase you in isolation." I forced myself to pull the horse around, every instinct screaming at me to continue fleeing. The creature climbed powerfully, its wings dragging a long, sinister shadow across the disturbed ground. I could see a streak of dark blood marking its left flank, evidence that at least one of our shots had found its mark. Its flight pattern wavered noticeably for a moment. The wound wasn't nearly enough to weaken it significantly, but it had been sufficient to slow its movements slightly and perhaps make it more cautious. Father motioned urgently for us to regroup. "Stay tight together. We form a defensive wall." We arranged ourselves into a rough line, all rifles raised and ready. The creature circled above us, steadily decreasing its altitude with every completed pass. It was clearly considering this new formation carefully, its movements less fluid now, more calculated. The wound on its flank dripped a slow, steady trail of blood that fell in thin streaks to the earth below. Rios rejoined our defensive line, breathing hard from his near-death experience, his hat missing somewhere in the chaos, one sleeve torn nearly off. "We've wounded it," he said, his voice tight, "but nowhere near enough to stop it." The creature folded its wings partially against its body and dropped toward us once more. This time, rather than targeting a single rider, it came in low with clear intent to strike at all of us simultaneously. It approached with wings fully spread to their maximum span, talons extended forward like the grasping hands of some demon. We fired together in a coordinated volley. The shots cracked through the dusty air in rapid succession. Dark feathers burst from its body in multiple locations. One bullet struck directly at its shoulder joint. Another hit near its throat with a wet impact. A third buried itself deep into the lower portion of its chest, penetrating something vital. The creature suddenly lost momentum mid-flight. Its wings faltered noticeably, their rhythm breaking. Instead of sweeping majestically over us, as it had clearly intended, it crashed heavily into the ground with a force that sent dust flying high into the air. The tremor from its impact knocked my horse sharply sideways. I hit the hard ground badly, the breath knocked completely out of me. I rolled instinctively, my ears ringing painfully, my vision blurred and obscured by thick dust. Through the haze, I could see the creature struggling to push itself upright. Its wings beat weakly, kicking up loose dirt in erratic patterns. Its head swung from side to side, searching for targets. Its eyes were darker now, somewhat unfocused, but still radiating danger. I heard boots running across the ground. Caleb reached me first and pulled me roughly to my feet. "Can you stand properly?" he demanded urgently. I nodded, though my legs trembled uncontrollably beneath me. Father approached the wounded creature cautiously, his rifle raised and aimed steadily. Rios moved carefully with him, staying on the opposite side to provide a flanking position. They advanced slowly, taking great care not to venture close enough for a final desperate strike from those still dangerous talons. The creature staggered noticeably, but somehow managed to spread its wings halfway despite its injuries. It released another guttural cry, considerably weaker than before, but still full of defiant fury. Caleb pulled his second rifle from his saddle and handed it to me without a word. "If it charges us directly, aim for the head," he instructed tersely. "Nothing else will stop it at this point." I steadied myself as best I could, my fingers gripping the weapon tightly. The creature shifted its weight, dragging one wing awkwardly across the ground, leaving a trail in the dust. Its chest heaved with increasingly labored breaths. Blood trickled steadily from multiple wounds, staining the pale dust a dark, rusty color. Father stopped approximately 10 paces from the creature. He lowered his rifle barrel slightly, carefully studying its movements and condition. "It's weakening significantly," he assessed aloud. "One more concentrated push should finish this." The creature raised its head with visible effort and locked eyes with Father directly. The intensity burning in its gaze tightened something deep in my chest. There is absolutely no fear whatsoever in its expression, only pure, undiluted defiance, the refusal of an apex predator to accept defeat. It lunged forward suddenly, not attempting to take flight, but charging directly across the ground. It moved faster than any of us had anticipated in its wounded state. Father fired immediately. The bullet struck its neck solidly. Caleb fired a split second later, his shot hitting just above the creature's right eye with devastating effect. The impact snapped the creature's head backwards violently. Its body swung sideways, powerful legs finally buckling beneath its weight. It hit the ground hard and slid forward in a long drag of scattered feathers and billowing dust. A profound silence fell over the entire basin. Even the cattle seemed to pause, waiting to see if the nightmare was truly over. The creature tried desperately to rise once more. Its wings flexed with tremendous effort. Its talons curled and scraped against stone. It managed to lift its head a few inches off the ground, but couldn't maintain the position. Its breath came in harsh, rattling gasps that gradually thinned and weakened. After one final, shallow exhale that seemed to last forever, its body sagged completely into the dirt. Everything went absolutely still. Father approached with extreme caution, his rifle still trained directly on the creature's eye. He nudged its beak carefully with the toe of his boot. There was no reaction whatsoever. He stepped closer, methodically examining the chest for any sign of breathing, then the wings, then the head. "It's dead," he announced finally, his voice carrying a note of profound relief. My legs very nearly gave out beneath me. Caleb exhaled hard and leaned heavily against his saddle for support. Rios ran a trembling hand across his face, shaking his head slowly in disbelief. I approached the creature's body with hesitant steps. Up close, its sheer size became absolutely overwhelming. The wings, even partially folded in death, stretched wider than any wagon we owned. The feathers were coarse and surprisingly heavy, built for power rather than delicacy. The beak, curved and wickedly sharp, looked strong enough to snap a man's arm like a dry twig. The talons, thick and hooked like iron grapples, had punctured deep into the ground during its final movements. "This thing has likely ruled this valley for years," Rios said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "Perhaps even longer than that. Perhaps decades." Father didn't reply immediately. He simply stared down at the creature for a long, contemplative moment, his jaw set firmly, his eyes distant. "We don't inform the neighbors of anything until we ride home with definitive proof," he finally said. "They need to know beyond any doubt that it's genuinely gone. They won't believe us otherwise. They'll think we're spinning tall tales or suffering from heat madness." Caleb rested his rifle against his shoulder, nodding agreement. "We transport it back whole, then." Father shook his head decisively. "We cannot possibly drag something of this enormous size all the way back to the ranch without breaking it to pieces in the process. We take feathers, talons, enough physical evidence to demonstrate conclusively what we encountered and destroyed. That will have to suffice." Rios nodded slowly. "That will be quite enough for them," he agreed. "Quite enough for anyone with eyes to see." I stood beside the fallen creature, my breath still coming unevenly, thick dust coating my clothes and skin, the vivid memories of its flight, its terrible hunting cries, the overwhelming force of its wings. All of it pressed through me in heavy, overwhelming waves. I felt the weight of the entire morning beginning to settle into my very bones, a weariness that went far beyond mere physical exhaustion. But beneath that crushing weight existed something else, a slow, steady calm born of survival. We had faced directly what had been hunting us. We had stood our ground and fought back. We had survived. And now, standing in the quiet basin with the fallen creature lying before us like some impossible trophy, I knew with absolute certainty that the story of this day would follow me for the remainder of my life, shaping everything that came after. Father instructed us to fetch our knives from the saddlebags. We approached the creature with continued caution, even though its body lay completely motionless. Nothing of such tremendous size died quietly or easily, and none of us were prepared to trust fully that its strength had entirely departed. But as we stepped close and stood beside it, the air immediately surrounding it held no movement whatsoever. The ground beneath its massive chest no longer rose and fell with breath. The absolute finality of its stillness gradually sank in. Up close, examining it properly for the first time, the feathers proved to be considerably heavier than I had expected. They lay in layered rows, thick and dense, almost more like overlapping plates of armor than conventional plumage. Caleb pressed his palm experimentally against one. "This material is tougher than cured leather," he observed with wonder. "You would require an extremely sharp blade just to cut through the edge cleanly." Father grasped one long primary feather near the wing joint and pulled firmly. It came free with a faint cracking sound, the quill extraordinarily thick. "We take several feathers from each wing," he directed, "and 2 talons at minimum. That quantity should prove sufficient evidence." The talons were curved, surprisingly heavy, and cold to the touch despite the day's heat. When I ran my thumb carefully along one, I could feel subtle ridges worn into the surface near the wickedly sharp point. I found myself imagining those ridges gripping through a cow's thick hide, or closing around a man's shoulder, and the thought made my ribs constrict uncomfortably. I cut 2 free with slow, deliberate sawing motions. They thudded onto the ground when released, feeling as solid and heavy as forged iron implements. Whilst we worked methodically, Rios circled the entire creature, examining the throat area, the wound on its flank, the full span of its wings with professional interest. He paused near the head and crouched down, studying it intently. He touched the feathers along the creature's neck, then traced his fingers across the hard curve of the beak. His brow creased with concern. "What is it?" Father asked, noting his troubled expression. "What have you found?" Rios didn't answer immediately. He brushed accumulated dust off the beak carefully, exposing faint but definite grooves etched across its surface, old scars worn into the very structure. "These marks aren't from cattle," he said slowly, his voice troubled. "These are extremely old marks, cut deep. Something fought this creature in serious combat years before today." Caleb walked closer to examine what Rios had discovered. "Another of its kind, perhaps," he suggested. "Territorial disputes?" "Perhaps," Rios acknowledged, though he sounded uncertain. "Or another predator entirely, something else that hunts in this region. Whatever left these particular marks wasn't small or weak. It was large enough and powerful enough to wound this creature and survive the encounter. The disturbing idea of more creatures similar to this one, or worse, something even more powerful and dangerous, hung heavy in the air around us. I tried not to let that frightening thought settle and take root. We had quite enough fear to wrestle with already without conjuring imaginary new threats. Once we had gathered everything we needed, Father stepped back and surveyed the massive corpse. "We leave the rest here," he decided. "Nature will take it in due course. Nothing will dare challenge it now that it's dead, and scavengers will dispose of the remains eventually." Caleb looked toward the distant ridge line nervously. "What if it wasn't alone out here?" he asked, voicing all our fears. "What if there are others of its kind?" Father answered without the slightest hesitation. "If there were more of them, they wouldn't have permitted us to kill this one without intervening. Predators of this magnitude protect their territory aggressively. This creature was hunting alone and jealously guarding its kills alone. If others existed, we would have encountered them by now." It wasn't complete reassurance, not entirely, but it was sufficient logic to prompt us into movement. We mounted our horses carefully. My mount trembled initially, ears pinned back flat against its head, but once I settled properly in the saddle and whispered soothingly to it, the animal calmed enough to move forward. The cattle had regrouped far across the basin, their bodies formed into a tight, defensive cluster, their calls low and persistently anxious. We guided them homeward with slow, gentle movements, using our calming presence more than our voices to settle them. None of us wanted to shout or make any sudden noise that might carry across the land and attract unwanted attention. The ride back toward the ranch was long and profoundly quiet. The sun climbed steadily higher, dragging oppressive heat across our backs. Dust rose from the cattle's hooves in soft, continuous waves. The edges of the basin and the ridges behind us gradually took on a strange stillness, as though the land itself had been holding its breath all morning and could finally begin to relax. Caleb rode at my side for a considerable portion of the journey. His shirt was torn in multiple places, and there was dried blood along his sleeve. Not his own, but from some close brush with danger during the chaotic battle. He kept his eyes focused ahead, his jaw tense with unresolved tension. "You all right?" I asked quietly, breaking the long silence. He nodded once, though not entirely convincingly. "I still feel it pressing on me," he admitted. The sheer force of it, the impossible size. I genuinely didn't think anything living on land could possibly be that strong, that large. I didn't either, I agreed honestly. He glanced sideways at me, his eyes shadowed. "When it went directly for you during that dive, I thought it had you for certain. I thought you were finished." "I thought so as well," I admitted, the memory making my hands tighten on the reins. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in deep thought. "We won't forget this day," he said with certainty. "No matter what the neighbors say, no matter if half of them refuse to believe us despite the evidence, we'll carry this with us. They'll believe when they see what we brought back." I said, try to inject some confidence in my voice. "That's not what I mean," he clarified. "We've seen how genuinely small and vulnerable we are out here in this vast country. I don't think I'll ever walk the range the same way again. I'll always be looking up now, wondering what else might be watching from above. I didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything meaningful I could add. He had articulated precisely what we were all feeling. By the time we finally reached the lower pastures, the heat pressed so heavily upon us that the air itself shimmered and wavered in visible waves. The cattle moved progressively slower, their tongues lolling out, their sides heaving with exhaustion. We guided them carefully toward shade and water, ensuring that none collapsed from the combined stress and heat. Even the familiar ranch buildings visible in the distance looked somehow different, closer and safer, certainly, yet paradoxically smaller against the backdrop of what we had just faced and overcome. Boyd was waiting at the fence line, leaning against a post. He must have spotted us from the ridge near his property. He approached with long, quick strides, dust rising around his boots, his face pinched with obvious worry and curiosity. "You drove them back earlier than planned," he observed, his eyes scanning our group and noting our condition. "I thought you were staying out there for 2 full nights." Father swung down from his horse with visible weariness. He untied the carefully wrapped bundle from his saddle. 2 long, primary feathers and 2 massive talons secured in cloth. He unrolled the cloth deliberately at Boyd's feet, letting the contents speak for themselves. Boyd bent over the objects, his face paling visibly. His hand hovered uncertainly, then touched one of the talons with hesitant fingers. Those fingers trembled noticeably. He didn't look up for several long seconds. When he finally did raise his head, his face had drained of all color. "Where did you obtain these?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Father's voice remained level and matter-of-fact. "Out on the North Range, in the basin beyond the ridges." "You actually killed it?" Boyd asked, disbelief and awe mixing in his tone. "You killed the thing that's been taking our stock?" Father nodded once, firmly. Boyd stared at the feather again, reaching out to touch it with something approaching reverence. "My boys heard it last week during the night," he said, his voice thick. "I told them it was merely thunder, that they were imagining things in the dark. God help me, I should have believed them." He stepped back from the objects as though they carried dangerous heat. "Others need to see this immediately," he declared. "They won't believe it's real without seeing the proof with their own eyes." "We'll show them," Father agreed. "But one thing at a time. We need to see to the herd first, ensure they're settled and watered." We brought the exhausted cattle into the home pastures whilst Boyd rode off quickly to gather the nearest families and spread the word. The ranch hands emerged from the barn, drawn by the unusual commotion. They watched us unload our gear with curious eyes, their attention tracking the wrapped bundle as though it contained something alive and dangerous. Mother stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron in an unconscious gesture. The very moment she saw our faces, dust-covered, exhausted, marked by our ordeal, her expression shifted dramatically. "What happened out there?" she asked, her voice strained with worry. Father didn't answer immediately. He placed the bundle gently on the porch rail, unwrapped it with careful movements, and displayed the feathers and talons for her inspection. Her breath caught audibly in her throat. She reached out tentatively, touched the very edge of one feather, then pulled her hand back sharply as though the thing might suddenly spring to life. "Was it near the house?" she asked, her voice tight with fear for her family. "Could it come here?" "No," Father answered firmly. "But it could have ventured this way eventually, sooner or later. It was only a matter of time." She looked at me, then Caleb, then Father again, relief and residual fear mixing visibly in her eyes. "You're all safely back. You're all right. We're here," Father confirmed simply. "We're home." We washed the thick dust from our faces and drank cold, sweet water from the well. My muscles ached deeply from the fall and the long, tense ride. My hands shook uncontrollably more than once when I attempted to hold the ladle steady enough to drink. The water tasted better than anything I could remember, each swallow a reminder that we had survived. People began arriving soon after, drawn by Boyd's urgent summons and the spread of rumors through the scattered ranching community. Boyd returned with his sons, all 3 of them looking grim and expectant. The Myers came from the South Tract, their wagon rattling into our yard. Several men from the next ranch overrode in together, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. They gathered on our porch, their eyes fixed with unwavering attention on the feathers and talons laid out for display. There was initial confusion, as expected, nervous laughter from those who thought this might be some elaborate jest. Then disbelief set in as they examined the objects more closely, touching them, weighing them, testing their reality. Finally, a quiet, profound awe settled over the assembled group, transforming into an almost reverent silence. One of Boyd's sons, a young man perhaps a year or two older than myself, leaned particularly close to the evidence. "Is it considerably larger than these items make it appear?" he asked, his voice hushed. Father nodded gravely. "Much larger. These are merely fragments, small pieces of the whole. The wingspan would stretch from one side of this yard to the other, perhaps beyond." Another man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "Was it alone out there? Are there others?" "We didn't observe another," Father answered carefully, choosing his words with precision. "We found no evidence of additional creatures, no other nests or hunting grounds." The questions continued in a steady stream. How exactly had it died? Were we absolutely certain it wouldn't somehow return? How long had it been hunting throughout the valley, preying on our livestock? What had driven it to our territory in the first place? Father answered what he could with patience, providing factual accounts whilst avoiding speculation. We remained near him throughout, listening carefully, adding specific details when directly asked. I described the sound of its wings, the pressure it created in the air. Caleb recounted the terrifying moment when it had charged Rios, nearly killing him. Rios himself displayed his torn sleeve and described the creature's shocking speed despite its enormous size. By the time the sun approached the horizon, the crowd had gradually thinned. People rode away slowly toward their own homes, carrying the weight of this new truth visible in their faces and posture. Some appeared profoundly shaken, as though their understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered. Some looked deeply grateful, relieved that the mysterious predator had been eliminated. All of them looked changed in some indefinable way, marked by the knowledge that something impossible had been proven real. After the last rider departed, leaving only settling dust in their wake, the yard grew quiet once again. The sun dipped majestically behind the western hills. A pale, gentle glow stretched across the darkening sky, painting it in shades of amber and deep purple. I leaned against the porch rail, staring out at the familiar fields, watching shadows lengthen and merge. Caleb joined me after a moment, standing close. He nudged my shoulder lightly in a gesture of companionship. "Feels like the land itself knows," he observed quietly. "Like it's noticeably calmer now, more settled." I listened intently to the evening sounds. The air held no strange pressure, no unnatural weight. No distant rumble disturbed the peace. No heavy-winged beats rolled across the valley from the distant ridges. "It does," I agreed softly. "It feels different, better." Father stepped out onto the porch behind us, his arms folded across his chest. He looked toward the north range, his eyes softened somewhat, though the hard lines etched by the day's events still marked his weathered face prominently. "It's finished," he said with finality. "The threat is eliminated." I desperately wanted to believe that with my whole heart, and in many significant ways, I truly did. The creature was dead. We had seen it fall, watched its final breath escape. But a quiet, persistent thought lingered stubbornly at the very edge of my mind, difficult to completely ignore or dismiss. If one creature of that impossible size and power could inhabit our valley for years, perhaps even decades, without any of us knowing of its existence, then what else might be waiting out there in the vast open stretches of land we had always so confidently assumed belonged to us alone? Still, the night settled peacefully and clear around our ranch. The sky stretched wide and magnificently calm above us. No winged beats crossed it. No shadows moved against the stars. The creature was genuinely gone. The valley had returned to quiet normalcy. The following days brought a peculiar mixture of relief and lingering unease to our ranch and the surrounding community. Word of our encounter spread rapidly through the territory, carried by riders and wagons, growing somewhat embellished with each retelling. Some accounts had us facing multiple creatures, engaging in an epic battle lasting hours. Others claimed the creature had been even larger than we'd described, capable of carrying off full-grown horses. Father grew increasingly irritated by these exaggerations. The truth is remarkable enough without such nonsense, he grumbled one evening as yet another visitor arrived seeking to hear the tale directly from us. Why must people always make things larger than they were? Because the truth is frightening, Mother said quietly from her seat on the porch. They make it into a story, something grand and heroic, because that's easier to bear than acknowledging how vulnerable we truly are out here. She was right, of course. I could see it in the eyes of those who came to view our evidence. They wanted to believe we had faced some legendary monster from ancient tales, something that belonged to myth rather than reality. The alternative was too unsettling. That creatures of such size and power could exist undetected in country we thought we knew intimately. The physical evidence we'd brought back proved invaluable in convincing the doubters. The feathers and talons were passed carefully from hand to hand, examined under sunlight, weighed and measured. Several men attempted to bend or break the talons and failed utterly. The feathers resisted cutting even with the sharpest knives, their structure unlike anything the local hunters and trappers had encountered. A territorial marshal visited our ranch a week after the incident, a gray-haired man named Hutchins who had spent decades in Arizona territory. He examined our evidence with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to separating fact from fiction. He measured the talons, sketched the feathers in a small notebook, and questioned each of us separately about what we'd witnessed. "I've heard stories," he admitted finally, sitting on our porch with a cup of coffee. "From the indigenous peoples, from old trappers, from miners working remote claims. Stories of enormous birds, creatures from before European settlement. The natives have names for them, Thunderbird being the most common. I always dismissed such accounts as superstition or misidentification." He touched one of the talons again, his expression troubled. "I won't make that mistake again. Do you believe there might be others?" Father asked directly, voicing the question that haunted all of us. Hutchins considered carefully before responding. "I honestly don't know. If this creature was as old as it appears, and those scars Rios mentioned suggest considerable age, then it may have been the last of its kind, a remnant from a previous era. Or," he paused, choosing his words cautiously, "or there may be others in more remote locations, places humans rarely venture. The territory is vast. We've barely explored a fraction of it." His words offered no real comfort, but at least they were honest. 3 weeks after our confrontation, Father decided we should ride back to the basin where we'd killed the creature. Several reasons drove this decision. We needed to verify that it was truly dead and not somehow recovered. We wanted to examine the site more thoroughly in calmer circumstances. And, though Father wouldn't admit it openly, we all felt a need for closure, to see the place again without the terror and chaos of battle. This time, our party numbered 6. Father, Caleb, Rios, and myself were joined by Boyd and Marshall Hutchins, who had expressed strong interest in documenting the site. We rode out on a cool morning in early autumn, when the oppressive heat had finally broken and the air carried hints of the changing season. The journey felt different this time. Still cautious, still watchful, but without the grinding tension that had accompanied our previous expedition. The cattle we passed in various pastures seemed calmer as well, grazing normally rather than clustering nervously with eyes turned skyward. When we finally reached the basin, the sight that greeted us was both expected and deeply strange. The creature's body remained where it had fallen, but 3 weeks of exposure to the elements and scavengers had transformed it significantly. Coyotes, vultures, and other carrion feeders had been at work, stripping away flesh and exposing the massive bone structure beneath. Yet even in this state of decay, the sheer size of the skeleton proved awe-inspiring. We dismounted and approached slowly. Hutchins pulled out his notebook and began sketching immediately, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. Boyd circled the remains several times, shaking his head in continued disbelief. The wingspan, Hutchins murmured, pacing from one wing tip to the other and counting his steps. Approximately 45 feet, perhaps slightly more. Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. The skull, partially cleaned by scavengers, showed clearly the formidable structure of the beak. Heavy bone designed for tremendous crushing force. The eye sockets were large, suggesting keen vision. The neck vertebrae indicated both strength and flexibility, allowing the head to turn and strike with precision. This creature was magnificently adapted to its role as an apex predator. Hutchins observed, his tone carrying professional admiration despite the terror this thing had caused. The wing bones are hollow but reinforced, reducing weight whilst maintaining strength. The leg bones are extraordinarily dense and powerful. This was a perfect hunting machine, likely unchanged for thousands of years. Rios had wandered toward the rock spires where we'd discovered the drag marks. He called out suddenly, his voice sharp. "You should see this." We joined him quickly. He'd ventured deeper into the narrow pass than we had during our first visit, following it to a small, sheltered chamber formed by overhanging rocks. There, scattered across the ground, we found bones, many bones. Cattle, certainly, but also what appear to be deer, wild horses, and other animals. Some were quite old, bleached white by time. Others were more recent. "This was its larder," Father said grimly. "Its feeding ground. How long has it been hunting here?" Hutchins knelt and examined several of the bones carefully. Years, certainly. Perhaps decades. Some of these remains are extremely old. He looked up at us, his expression somber. "Gentlemen, I believe you eliminated a creature that had been preying on this valley for a very long time, possibly since before any of us settled here." We spent another hour documenting the site. Hutchins made detailed sketches and measurements. We gathered a few additional feathers and smaller bones that might serve as further evidence. The sun climbed higher, warming the basin, and I found myself repeatedly glancing at the sky, an instinct I suspected would never entirely leave me. As we prepared to depart, I took one final look at the creature's remains. Despite everything it had done, despite the terror it had caused and the livestock it had killed, I felt an odd sort of respect for it. It had been a survivor, a remnant of some ancient time, doing what its nature demanded. We had killed it to protect what was ours, and that was right and necessary. But I couldn't help wondering what the world had been like when such creatures had been common rather than rare, when humans had been prey rather than the dominant force. "Ready?" Father asked, pulling me from my thoughts. I nodded. "Yes, I'm ready." We rode home as the day aged around us, carrying our additional evidence and our confirmed peace of mind. The creature was truly dead. Its reign over the valley had ended. Life could return to normal, or at least to whatever passed for normal after witnessing the impossible made real. The months following our encounter brought subtle but definite changes to how we approached life on the ranch and in the broader territory. Ranchers who had previously dismissed precautions as unnecessary paranoia now kept weapons closer at hand. Cattle were moved into more defensible pastures when possible. Night watches became more common and more alert. But beyond these practical adjustments, something more fundamental had shifted in how we viewed our place in this land. The comfortable assumption that we were the undisputed masters of our environment had been shattered. We had learned, viscerally and unforgettably, that unknown dangers could exist in country we thought we knew completely. I noticed this change most clearly in how I moved through the world. Before, I had ridden the range with casual confidence, my attention focused on the ground, tracking cattle, checking fence lines, watching for familiar landmarks. Now I found myself regularly scanning the sky, alert to any unusual shadows or distant movements. That automatic vigilance became second nature, as ingrained as breathing. Caleb experienced it too. We talked about it sometimes in the evenings, sitting on the porch after the day's work was finished. "Do you think it will ever feel normal again?" he asked one night. "The way it did before?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't know," I admitted. "Perhaps this is the new normal. Being more aware, more cautious, more respectful of what we don't know. Father thinks we're being overly cautious, Caleb said. He believes the threat is finished. Father needs to believe that, I replied. He has a ranch to run, a family to support. He cannot afford to jump at every shadow. But I think deep down he's changed too. He just won't admit it. The creature's remains eventually became something of a landmark. Travelers would sometimes detour to view the skeleton, which had been largely picked clean by scavengers but remained substantially intact, held together by dried sinew and a natural arrangement of the bones. Some people took small fragments as souvenirs, despite our objections. Within a year, the site had acquired an almost legendary status. People spoke of the place where the Thunderbird fell. Marshall Hutchins included a detailed report of the incident in his official records, complete with his sketches and measurements. He sent copies to various scientific societies and government offices, arguing that the remains should be properly documented and possibly preserved for study. Whether anything came of those communications, I never learned. The territories were still wild and largely lawless in those days. Scientific pursuits took a distant second place to simple survival. Now, decades removed from that fateful summer, I find myself reflecting on those events with a mixture of pride, wonder, and lingering unease. I'm an old man now, my writing days long behind me. The ranch passed to Caleb's children after Father died, and they run it with the same dedication we once brought to that harsh land. But the story endures. My grandchildren ask me to recount it regularly, their eyes wide with excitement as I describe the creature's impossible size, the terror of its attack, the desperate battle that followed. I tell them the truth as I remember it, refusing to embellish or exaggerate as so many others have done over the years. The reality requires no enhancement. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I wonder about questions that have no answers. Was it truly the last of its kind? Had others existed once, in times before human settlement pushed into every corner of the territory? Could others still exist somewhere in the vast wilderness areas that remain unexplored? I wonder too about what else might be out there, unknown and waiting. The world is larger and stranger than most people imagine. We see only the surface, the familiar patterns. Beneath and beyond, mysteries persist. The scars from that encounter, both physical and psychological, never entirely faded. I still carry a slight limp from my fall during the battle, a reminder that flares up in cold weather. More significantly, I carry the memory of looking up into those ancient, intelligent eyes and realizing how small and vulnerable I truly was. That realization changes a person fundamentally. But I also carry pride. We face something beyond our understanding, beyond our experience, and we prevailed. Not through superior strength or size. We were hopelessly outmatched in those regards, but through cooperation, determination, and perhaps a measure of luck. We protected what was ours, defended our families and our livelihood, and eliminated a genuine threat to our community. The valley is peaceful now, has been for all these years. Cattle graze, unmolested, their heads down, focused on the grass rather than watching the sky with nervous eyes. New families have settled in the territory, building ranches and farms, living their lives without knowledge of what once hunted here. But there are still nights, particularly during summer when the heat grows oppressive and storms build strangely on the horizon, when I find myself listening. Listening for that deep, rhythmic beating. Listening for that pressure in the air that signals something vast moving overhead. I have never heard it again. The creature is gone, its bones long since scattered and buried by time and weather. The basin where we fought it has been reclaimed by grass and sage, showing no signs of that desperate battle. Yet I remain vigilant, because I have seen what can hide in plain sight, existing for years without detection. I have learned that the world holds mysteries we can scarcely imagine, and that the boundary between the known and unknown is far thinner than comfortable certainty suggests those who might read this account years or decades hence. I offer both warning and reassurance. The warning is this: never grow so comfortable in your dominion over the land that you forget to look up, to watch, to remain alert to possibilities beyond your current understanding. The world is vast, and we understand only fragments of it. The reassurance is equally important. When faced with the unknown, when confronted by threats that seem insurmountable, human courage and cooperation can prevail. We're not helpless. We are not victims. We can adapt. We can fight. We can survive. The summer of 1890 taught me these truths. That oppressive heat, those mysterious disappearances, that terrifying confrontation, all of it shaped who I became and how I live the remainder of my life. I faced something impossible that proved to be terribly, undeniably real. I looked into the face of a legend and discovered it had teeth and talons and merciless hunting eyes. And I survived. The Thunderbird is gone from our valley now, relegated to stories told around evening fires and cautionary tales shared among ranchers. But it was real. I have the scars to prove it, the memories that remain vivid despite the passage of time, and the absolute certainty that comes from direct experience. Let those who doubt seek out the old records, the marshal's reports, the testimony of those who examined the evidence. Let them speak to the families who lost livestock to an unknown predator that summer, who lived in fear until we rode out and ended the threat. Or better yet, let them venture into the wild places that remain, the remote corners where humans rarely tread. Let them watch the sky at dusk and dawn. Let them listen to the wind and wonder whether that distant sound might be something more than weather. Because the world is stranger than we know, deeper than we imagine, fuller of mystery and danger and wonder than comfortable civilization likes to acknowledge. I survived the Thunderbird's hunt. I killed it alongside my father, my brother, and brave companions. But I never forgot the lesson it taught me. We share this world with forces we barely comprehend, and respect for the unknown is not paranoia. It is wisdom. That summer of 1890 lives in my memory still, as clear and vivid as though it happened yesterday, rather than decades ago. The weight of that heat, the pressure of those wings, the terrible beauty of a perfect predator in flight. I am grateful we survived. I am grateful we prevailed. And I am grateful, in a strange way, that I witnessed something so extraordinary, so impossible, so utterly beyond the ordinary experiences of human life. The Thunderbird is gone, but its memory endures, carved into my bones and written in my soul. Author's final note. This account was written in 1934 by James William Carson, one of the participants in the events described. He died peacefully in 1936 at the age of 63. His original manuscript, along with the preserved feathers and talons from the creature, remained in his family's possession for decades before being donated to the Arizona Historical Society, where they remain on display to this day. Whether readers choose to accept this account as factual or dismiss it as frontier legend is, of course, their prerogative. The evidence exists. The documentation is available. The choice to believe or not rests with each individual. But for those who venture into the wild places, who work the land and live close to nature's remaining mysteries, they understand. They know that the world holds secrets still, that legends sometimes have foundations in truth, and that looking up at the vast sky, one can never be entirely certain what might be looking back.